and what are the conflicts and things like that. A short introduction of Dominic, or you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dominic. I work on decentralized protocols and crypto generally. I work for a company called String Labs, and we have two projects at the moment. One called Affinity, which is kind of distributed virtual computer with a kind of slightly different focus to Ethereum. And a thing called Phi, which is a kind of decentralized version of commercial banking.
All right, so Vitalik already mentioned that some interesting thing that is part of Affinity is BLS signatures, but we will go into this in a moment. Just to get started, so I want to just quickly, from each of you, throw out the number or a short answer on those questions about your system, so your version of Casper, your version of Casper, your version of Affinity and Tendermint. What are properties on those questions? So first question is finalization time. What do you assume can you reach?
5 seconds.
Early initial versions around an hour. And I would also make the claim that it's not realistic to claim that you can do less than an hour, because within the next few years there's a risk of like protocol issues, hard fork software bugs, and so forth. And I'm not sure that like a finalization time that's less than the amount of time that it takes for like developers to figure out what a bug is even meaningful finalization at all.
Okay, we will have an interesting panel.
Yeah, I mean, nodes know when they decide, though. So if just because you've decided something on your node doesn't mean that your node won't get patched later and therefore become a different node, you know. But like a decision is meant to be finalized from the point of view of the software that's making that decision. And so even though if in practice it isn't finalized, the software thinks it is, and so it counts. In my world right now, my version of Casper is asynchronous, which basically means that I don't have any liveness at all. I have like no. I mean, in practice, I don't know. Probably be pretty fast, but in theory, I have no guarantee at all that we will even come to finality, because in an asynchronous network with faulty nodes, that's like the nature of FLP. You know, this FLP impossibility result. So it could take forever in theory, but it can also happen very fast. But you know, there's no like theoretical argument for what I can give you there.
So we have just a blockchain running on a single data center that's going at really, you know, finality is very fast, on the order of 200 milliseconds. But we're not even trying to make it fast. We can go much faster than that. But for a global, so it depends on the number of validators and how geographically distributed it is. For the global blockchain that we're trying to create, we want it to be the most secure blockchain ever. We're targeting a finality, transaction finality or block time of 3 seconds. And we'll be able to support more and more validators in the future as well.
Okay, we will go into this deeper, but I will go through the other questions. What is your expected number of validators?
Well, you aim for a network of more than 1 million. So all of the protocols we work on, before any kind of research or design work goes into them, we always assume that the network has more than 1,000 validators. But we don't see validators in the same way as traditional proof-of-stake projects. Because if you want to create a scalable network, you need to actually think about computational resources. So in actual fact, you need to create mining identities, and you need cryptographic ways of determining whether these mining identities are actually performing the tasks that they're supposed to do, such as keeping some unique copy of state, right? So validation's one piece of it, but actually if you want to create a scalable network, you've also got to think about computational resource. It's not just enough to say, oh, well, this guy's deposited some stake, and therefore he's going to be able to mine a block this many times. That kind of architecture doesn't, in my view, lead to good scalability, or doesn't provide a good foundation for creating scalable distributed virtual computers. So you know, it's a slightly different approach. Of course, you know, these individual processes with mining identities do have responsibilities that include validation, but you know, one of the other I mean, a lot of these questions are, difficult to answer directly because, you ask what's the time till finality. Well, that means that's a probabilistic. That's a probabilistic thing, right? You have to actually put numbers on it to be able to answer it. But in our case, we have a scalable validation layer. You cannot actually have an infinitely scalable virtual machine without a global validation layer. It's a fallacy that you can do validation on each shard individually and you can maintain security. You have to have a global validation there. Now, necessarily, if you're processing billions or trillions of transactions a second and your network stores exabytes of state, there's no way each process can validate every transaction or even a tiny fraction of the transactions. So in fact, you have to have some mechanism for partitioning validation. So the kind of conventional idea of validation or everyone being a validator of some blockchain, it's very sort of, it's kind of like that works with a kind of 2008 kind of view of blockchains where everybody reapplies every transaction since Genesis and checks that they've got the same set of unspent transaction outputs, right? But when you're talking about, scalable virtual machines, that kind of thing just doesn't apply. So, you can talk about how many processes you have in your network, and in our case, we look at protocols that can cope with any number. But then, although they're all validating things, typically an individual state transition would only be validated by a subset, which was determined by a random beacon. So it's not. It's a kind of more nuanced answer, I suppose.
Okay.
Well, to answer the original question, I'd say in earlier versions 10,000, in later versions millions. The other thing I'd point out is that I think in later versions of scalable systems, we're also going to see multiple classes of validators, and particularly we're going to see multiple classes of validating behavior. So one of the two most important distinctions, I think, is between validating data and validating state. So in Bitcoin and Ethereum and most other blockchains so far, validators basically do two things at the same time. Or one of them is that they say these here is a block header and a crypto Merkle points to a bunch of transactions, and I certify that these transactions exist. But then it also says, look, I also either here's a state root and I certify that this is the result of applying all the transactions, or even in Bitcoin's case, it certifies that all the transactions are valid, which actually is a claim about previous state as well. And I think that you can actually design much better scalable systems in the long term by separating out attesting to data availability and attesting to the result of applying the data. So one example is that you could imagine having this sharded network with a large number of shards. And you could imagine validators being almost immediately reshuffled around and told, here, come up with a data block for shard 39, now come up with a data block for shard 387. And because all they're doing is they're attesting to a few particular pieces of data, they don't actually have to download the state of shard 39 in order to say anything. And then you can create this really optimized and high performance data layer. And once you have the assumption of data availability as a base, then on top of that, it turns out you actually can create very secure mechanisms for doing state calculations. If you're willing to accept liveness assumptions, then if there's even one honest state validator, then that one honest state validator can pretty much eventually prove that all the other state validators on the network are wrong. And those are that's a property that's potentially very powerful. It can achieve very high degrees of robustness and security, and also really help make cross-shard communication much faster than the 12 hours that I was talking about before.
Yeah, so kind of echoing some of Vitalik's sentiment, I feel like the set of nodes who are validators is actually could be much larger than the set of nodes who are forming consensus. So to me, the biggest set of nodes, the ones that guarantee availability, and then there's nodes that validate, and then there's nodes that form consensus. And in my opinion, we don't actually need that many nodes forming consensus as long as we have a lot of nodes validating. Basically, validators will make sure that your transaction receipts are correct in terms of correct executions of the virtual machine, and the consensus forming nodes kind of engage in this process of finalizing.
So for you, a validator is everyone who runs a full node, and consensus forming are those who have a something at stake?
So validators have a special role in the protocol in the sense that they have deposits and they can provide these signatures on blocks that like are economically meaningful, rather than just like full nodes.
Consensus forming nodes don't have economically meaningful signatures in your system?
No, the consensus forming nodes are also validators. They're a subset of.
And what makes them special?
The consensus forming ones?
Yeah.
They're actually the ones that are involved in forming consensus. They're the ones who are placing bets.
But if validators have something at stake, why are they not part of?
Oh, because like
Or how can they lose some stake?
There's overhead. There's like quadratic overhead in the number of nodes for the finality cycle, and so like it makes sense to have there be less nodes converging like.
So every validator could potentially be part of the consensus forming.
Yeah, although if you have a separation of roles, you don't need that. I mean,
just to
sure, yeah.
complete this round.
Okay, so for me, a validator is a consensus signer, and I think the number of validators that we need is really dependent on how fault tolerant we want it. But like, just because we have a lot of validators doesn't mean the security is proportionally that much better. I think the security is maybe like log of n, like proportional to log of n, where n is the number of validators. So if you already have 100, like 1,000 isn't 10 times better. Maybe it's marginally better. So given that and the price of running a machine, and the cost of where in BFT algorithms, more validators means the whole system slows down marginally more. I think the sweet spot today is like 100 to 300, and in the future it might go up to 1,000 soon, might even go up to 10,000, but probably not much higher. But okay, on the other hand, I have this notion of validator alliance, where a group of validators decide to validate not just one blockchain, but a whole list of blockchains. So in that case, one validator will have like a data center rack full of blockchain servers. So this complicates. Maybe we have a difference of lexicon here. Thank you.
All right. So next question: will in your system are there block reorgs, or do you?
You need something that's consistent to create a scalable decentralized network, because there's going to be some kind of top-level record of agreement, right? It's not consensus, actually. Blockchains don't reach consensus. Anything that's got a sort of probabilistic element to it isn't consensus. Consensus is a protocol which you can run, and it decides the result, and everyone can stop doing it. In a blockchain, if you stop, then someone's going to make a new longer chain or something like that, right? But you're going to have some top-level record of agreement, and that's going to record state roots. And this thing is going to drive the rest of the network, right? So imagine if you had, a million machine network providing a scalable virtual machine, right? Effectively, by decentralized protocol execution. If that top-level thing was reorganizing all the time, there'd be all kinds of other structures that were driven by that top-level record that would also have to reorganize. So it would be very, very difficult to design protocols that could reorganize themselves in sort of sync, right? And it would also be very inefficient. So our solution to this is minimally to have a incorruptible, unmanipulable, unpredictable source of randomness that just is absolutely unforkable. And all of our protocols depend on that. And we do this using something called threshold relay, which involves groups of processes producing unique deterministic threshold signatures, right? And these particular kind of threshold signatures are interesting because when the group produces this signature, right, there's only one possible signature that can be produced. The group has a public key, and let's say you have a threshold of 50%, right? Like in Bitcoin, you require 50%. So 50% of your group, it's a bit different, but 50% of your group has to be correct, be functioning, and they can produce this signature. Whichever 50% of that group participate in creating the threshold signature. It's always the same. And clearly, it's a random number. If it wasn't a random number, you'd be able to predict what the signature was, and anybody would be able to sign, right? So you can imagine a system where, one group produces a threshold signature. This deterministically selects another group, and that next group has to sign the threshold signature of the previous group, and so on. So you get a deterministic chain of randomness that is released on the agreement of each of these groups. And that's unforkable, right? And the interesting, just to give you an idea of how robust this is, if you had 10,000 processes, right? And let's say 30% of them, 33%, a third of them are faulty. So you've got 3,333 faulty processes within the 10,000, which is already pretty bad. If you take a random sample of 400, right? The chance that 200 or more are faulty, i.e. not functioning, down, controlled by the adversary, is 10 to the minus 12, which is a very small probability. So you can create this chain of randomness that's completely deterministic, unmanipulable, incorruptible, unpredictable, unforkable, right? And you can use this to drive your network. And it turns out that once you have this incorruptible, unmanipulable, unpredictable, unforkable chain of randomness being produced, you can then build all kinds of very sophisticated protocols on top of it, and that's how you get scalability. And I believe that it'll be proven somehow through theoretical computer science. There is actually no way of creating an infinitely scalable virtual machine, decentralized virtual machine, without such a source of randomness.
Just to give some context, so Vitalik mentioned this earlier, for proof-of-stake systems, we need a source of randomness. Problem is if you just say, okay, the last one who submits the block, this submission of the block will generate a new random number. Well, you can withhold your last piece of information, the block. In this system, in the BLS threshold signature system, the beauty of it is that as long as one of the remaining parties is available, or let's say you have 50 out of 100, and you are at stage 49, then not the number 50 needs to be available, but just one out of the remaining 50 parties needs to be available, and you still always produce the same random number. So question to Vitalik and Vlad, if we have this system and it seems to be superior, why not use it for Casper?
I mean, personally, I'm actually just like, I guess intuitively, like I really love this idea that I can make Ethereum 2.0 rely on literally nothing but random oracle property of SHA-3 as a security assumption. So like no like elliptic curve graph properties, like no nothing else, just SHA-3. And I mean, aside from that, I think like the tech is really cool.
Well. So I guess I have two things to say. One of them is the current spec of Casper that I'm working on doesn't fork after finality, but before finalized blocks. For non-finalized blocks, there can be reversion. And the reason that we have this is basically that if a certain proportion of the nodes go offline, we can still produce economically meaningful commitments, even though we don't have finality in the full sense of the word. But this kind of raises this quite a point about the threshold signatures, and kind of more generally about consistency favoring consensus protocols, is that they do require this threshold of nodes to be online. And one of the big design requirements that I have for Casper is that a very large number of nodes, a majority of the nodes, all but one node, really strictly speaking, should be able to fail permanently, and the system should be able to recover without a hard fork. And this is not a property of any system that requires a threshold for any blocks to be produced, for any high-level randomness to be produced, or anything like this.
I think here we can go deeper into it. So this question of availability or consistency. So you, what would be your opinion? Should the blockchain continue if there's only one validator online, or?
No, I mean, it reminds me actually of a conversation Vlad and I had late at night, I think in Berlin, like 2 years ago or a year, I don't know. Anyway, and the argument was, I was arguing for consistency and he was arguing for availability. And I think as the argument went, Vlad's a great troll. He ended up saying that he wanted his system to be able to record his StarCraft scores, whatever happened, right? And But I mean, from my point of view, I think I think systems should stop working at some point if there aren't enough participants online. I mean, one of the great weaknesses of Bitcoin, in my view, is that it does continue working. So if you imagine there was some kind of political tensions in the South China Sea, right? There's like a cyber warfare button that both China and America have to prevent the secret services disrupting each other's infrastructure, and they'll press the button and the link will just break. And then there'll be just some diplomacy, and after a week or hopefully whatever, it'll be resolved, and they'll press the button and the internet will come back up. Meanwhile, of course, there'll be two forks on both sides of the Pacific, right? And whoever has the most hashing power will ultimately be the winner. But I don't think that's a good situation, right? Because somebody is, there's going to be half the world, effectively is going to lose, and we don't know who it is. It depends on who's got the most hashing power. But that doesn't feel like a good system to me. So I would rather that we designed consistent systems that are very fault tolerant, but at some point they're going to have to fail, right? So I think if you can withstand, almost 50% of the participants being offline and still work, that's pretty good, and that should be good enough. And actually, if we get to a situation where, so much of the network's down, it would be actually sort of better anyway to stop for safety purposes, right? That'd be my kind of preference.
First, Jay, should the system continue if 50% of the nodes are down or not?
Sure. I think that depends on the type of application you want to build. So like for a kind of application that only deals with like transferable tokens, for example, which is what we're doing with the Cosmos network, you can just have a global or like a virtual center that acts as the center around which many other blockchains connect to as sidechains. And if there's a global network partition, even though the center will be off, all the periphery sidechains will continue to function. And if they're regional, then all the better, right? And then when the network kills, people will be able to move tokens again. But meanwhile, they can use Lightning Network or other means, or not even, or just stay within their blockchain. So that's one way to mitigate. I want to go back to address something about randomness, but okay.
Okay, maybe shortly, Vlad's StarCraft response, or?
Yeah, so I just want to say that, I kind of agree with Dominic that the way that Bitcoin works today isn't great, because people on both sides of the network will get blocks and they'll think they're just normal blocks, and they'll count their 6 confirmations, and then they'll like release funds or something. I think the nice thing about, like, the thing that I'm trying to provide with Casper, and the nice thing that about proof of stake protocols is that you can tell how much of the stake is on your side of the partition, and so you can tell, even you can tell that you aren't safe, because it's not enough of it is there for you to be safe. But still, you do have economically meaningful commitments from the validators who are on your side of the partition. They will be bound to not equivocate and not make messages in a certain way that doesn't include messages that include your transactions later. You get real guarantees even when you aren't safe from the point of view of finality.
You just have to make sure the validators won't fight each other out to the death when it merges.
No, you give them a protocol, and then they just use the protocol.
Your response to the randomness problem.
Oh yeah. So Dominic has a great way of solving. He knows very well about. There's 2 ways to circumvent the FLP impossibility result. One way is by assuming some notion of time, and the other way is with having a common coin or a random number. But the reason why I avoid that is because the cryptography there is unproven. It requires the Diffie-Gap-Hillman assumption, which I have no idea. But I do know that we can create Lamport signatures, which means that Tendermint is a system of consensus that works with nothing but hashing. Right? So, and going back to your allegation that you can't scale Ethereum up, or in general computation up, without a random number generator, I can conceive of a way to do that by forking the Cosmos hub to connect to many other Ethereum sidechains and delaying packets between one node to another to create some room for contesting results. And I think that will scale just fine.
I actually don't believe either of you. I don't think anyone can scale a decentralized system infinitely if you are also giving consistency properties across the whole system.
So just to respond to a bunch of stuff at once, I think, just to reiterate what Vlad said, one of the nice things about Casper is that I feel like it provides the best of both worlds in that you have an availability favoring backbone, and there's differences in how this can be implemented, but on top of this backbone, you have this finality gadget. And so if you have a chain where if you have most of the validators being present, then the finality gadget keeps on triggering, blocks keep on getting finalized, and people who really care about their application and needing finality can just watch for finality and not do whatever they need to do until finality actually triggers. But if the chain does split in half, then the two chains continue, but this finality gadget never triggers. Now, to answer the point from a while back about, well, aren't validators going to lose money because they make bad bets and eventually one chain is going to win? So the answer there is basically that because the finality gadget only starts when it notices that more than 2/3 of validators are online, and it only sort of starts spiraling up exponentially if at least 2/3 of validators are complicit in the process. So if there is that kind of fork there, then basically the only kinds of bets that validators are going to make are bets with 1-to-1 odds. And so sure, one side's going to win and one side's going to lose, but the side's going to lose is basically only going to lose like a day's worth of validating rewards. And within 2 days, they're going to get that back. So that's how I feel like things are, that's how things will work in the short term. In the long term, one kind of model I'm interested in is some kind of model where if a long-term partition happens, then perhaps it would in some ways like automatically organize and figure out sort of recombining rules where it will automatically say, shards number 1 through 39 are shards that are in sort of the U.S. hemisphere favoring, then shards 40 through 79 are China hemisphere favoring, and shard 80 will be like Russia favoring because nobody likes Russia, and and the idea is there that that was to sort of go in the spirit of kind of Kwon's idea of systems working like even if the internet breaks in half, so that even if you can't talk to anyone, you can still talk to like as many people as possible. That way the network would still people would still feel confident that if they're in the US and they have an application on let's say shard 35, that it actually is going to be finalized even if it recombines. And if they're in China, well, they can not do anything on shard 35, but they can go and do stuff on shard 63. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to experiment in models like that.
Okay, so I have a few more questions.
Can I add something quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Just to mention about BLS, because it is absolutely secure, and it was designed by Dan Bonnet, who's one of the world's most renowned cryptographers, and he put it out there in 2003, I think, and it's been peer-reviewed, and it's actually pretty simple cryptography too, so it's not something that's very mysterious. So there's absolutely no doubt about it.
Simple.
Well, not simple, but it's not, as compared with some of the stuff that's out there, it's not
I'd bet my money that it was secure, but I wouldn't bet the global economy's money that it was secure.
Honestly, Dan Bonnet's stuff is, if you trust, ECDSA, you should trust BLS, right? So,
Hold on there. BLS does rely on strictly stronger security assumptions. And
okay, well,
to be fair, pairings are substantially scarier than elliptic curve multiplication.
Do you trust it?
And I trust the...
Give your mic to Vitalik.
Yeah,
Would you trust it?
So, well, for me personally, ECDSA has passed the I have implemented it test, and pairings haven't.
But would you trust BLS, Vitalik? Would you trust, yes or no, would you trust BLS?
0.9 something I'm not fully convinced about. And this will be a segue for Vlad to go talk about frequentism.
You should go and talk to, you have to go and talk to Dan Bonnet. I'm not the man, but I think most people within the cryptographic community accept that BLS is sound. Right?
Yeah, but is it sound to assume that the threshold will be online in an oligopolistic public network setting?
Okay, that's back to the consistency availability problem. I have a few more questions that are hopefully short to answer and mainly directed towards Casper. If they are relevant for you, then please answer them as well. What do you assume is the bonding time? So the time, yeah.
For me personally, bonding like as 12 to 24 hours. Unbonding, it depends, anywhere between a week and 4 months.
Okay,
Like
week
I
and
feel
4
like it's a trade-off between capital efficiency and how often like regular users have to go online to remain security.
Vlad, your numbers?
So, sorry, was that 1 hour or 2 hours to become bonded?
Oh, the unbonding,
24 to become and a week to 4 months to unbond.
Okay, but you can be you can stay bonded for a variable amount of time between. Okay, yeah. So for me in my current preferred system, I have like this like 6-month bonding periods.
unbonding period, I guess, or
Both. So there's 6-month bonding periods, and like you have to place a bond transaction in like period n to be bonded for period n+2, and then like you have to serve for all of that, and then like if you don't place another bond transaction, then you're going to be unbonded for the next one, and that will also take 6 months. That's my preferred. I mean, I could probably shorten the unbond time, but I like for people to have when they sign up, they're doing time. Like it's not a happy place to be a validator to me, right? You're putting your deposits down. You're going to serve the clients. You've bound yourself to this duty. You're going to be there for at least 6 months. If you sign up again in 6 months, you're gonna be there for 6 months longer, and I don't want to retain very much flexibility about it at all, because as I do that, I have less guarantees that I can provide clients about which validators will be online.
Okay.
And so by having these discrete mandatory sentences that validators have to serve, I give clients the guarantee that they will always know 100% of the validator set.
how much percentage of all Ether do you assume will be staked?
I want it to be as small as possible.
As small as possible.
Um,
So a number? 5%, 2%, 1%? Less than 1%.
10 to 35%.
Okay, interesting.
So my feeling is that what we need to be is confident that we can recover from all the failure modes, and willing to pay less for consensus. Right? I think right now, if you look at how much we're paying, like 1 million Ether per month for consensus, I think it's outrageous, the price. I think as a community, we should be trying to spend as little as possible on consensus, and accept that if we are willing and if we pay less, then it might fail more often. But if we understand how to recover from failure, that's actually a good bargain.
So
I'm probably concerned about failure modes that are not so obviously blatant that there's like a natural shelling point around just like, hey, let's hard fork it, but are at the same time pretty serious. So things like sort of a long run, 50% plus, like partial soft censorship or whatever.
So, I mean, consensus doesn't cost money in Ethereum. Sybil resistance costs money in Ethereum.
Well, I mean,
I think we just sort of like naturally think of like we think of consensus participation as being more sort of like a liquid than a solid, like it's already is in terms of dollars rather than in terms of any kind of units. So same thing.
Okay.
what do you think will be the ratio between consensus costs and attacking the system? So in my opinion, that is one of the big promises of proof of stake, that in proof of work, the ratio is 1-to-1. So if $1 million are burned per day, then the attacking costs are basically $1 million or less. And proof of stake, the promise is that this ratio will become better, right?
it's like basically 1-to-1 over R, where like R is like the risk-adjusted discount rate for this capital. And because the idea is that attackers would lose money on the order of the security deposits, but the cost of consensus will just be on the order of the interest on those deposits.
Yeah.
I think the big change between proof of work and proof of stake is that in proof of work, the cost for the adversary to break the network is bounded, right? If I'm looking at Bitcoin, I know what the hash power is, and similarly with Ethereum, and if I acquire a little less than 50%, I can really mess the network up, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that once this has happened, there's nothing you can really do about it. If I acquired half the hash rate in Bitcoin and I wanted to break it, pretty much that's the end of Bitcoin. The miners could add more hash power, I could add more hash power, but there's nothing anybody can do to take my hash power away. I.e., I have bounded cost, which of course is a huge security failing. This is one of the biggest design flaws in Bitcoin today, right? Not a design flaw, but shortcomings, right? Huge vulnerability. You can just look at these systems and say, right, this is how much hash power there is. If I have half of that, or sorry, equal to what's there already,
Right.
I can disrupt the network. The difference with proof of stake is potentially we can expel faulty validators, if you want to call them that, right? So you can do that in the protocol itself sometimes. Like a validator can be Byzantine and you can expel it. But in extremis, you can actually say, right, we're going to fork the network, right? And these are the validators that are disrupting the network. And we're going to make a decision as a community to fork the network and delete these validators from the ledger, right? And the adversary who controlled those validators now has to create new validators in the new network by investing more money. So we've changed the equation from one where he has bounded costs, right? He can destroy the network with bounded costs. That's the situation today with Bitcoin and Ethereum. We've changed the situation to one where he has potentially unbounded costs. And this is a huge advance in security. So I think people should think about that particular aspect and how we can magnify that and really leverage that. Because once you have, by the way, one of the reasons that Bitcoin has this doctrine of massive hashing power is because the adversary has bounded costs, right? If you don't have massive hashing power, the adversary can just look at it and say, well, that's not much money, I'll invest that and I'll break Bitcoin. And that's why, Bitcoin has this doctrine of we need huge amounts of hashing power.
So I have 2 pages more of questions, but I don't want to be selfish, and the time is running out. So I think it's time to open, open to the audience for questions.
Okay, if I make a comment, a quick comment and a question. On what Dominic just said, I completely disagree. With proof of work, I'm not sure there's even much difference between this, in terms of this aspect, between proof of stake and proof of work. In proof of stake, just as in proof of work, you know how much money is currently bounded. So you know exactly how much money you have to put in additionally to compromise the system, just like in proof of work.
Yeah, Greg, just quickly though, the difference is that money can be taken away from you. If you have hashing hardware,
yes, and
I can't take that off you, right?
so can your mining equipment. So just as in,
But not within the protocol, right?
Yes, the protocol can be changed. So you can hard fork Bitcoin, change the mining algorithm, and boom.
But then you're taking away everyone's mining equipment, not only of the attacker, right?
Okay, let's get
So the question. One of my interests is in how the terminology that people use ends up being their own undoing. So I have a question regarding the use of the word validators that's often come up. In a lot of the slides and a lot of the presentations, it's said, for example, the randomization of validators, like in Casper or the Moth paper, where validators are said to be randomly assigned to different shards. In reality, my understanding is it's not really validators that are being assigned randomly to different shards, but it's stake that's being randomly assigned to different shards. So my question for you guys is, do you have any sort of anti-Sybil mechanism there to increase the probability that you're actually shuffling validators and not just shuffling addresses owned by the same person?
Go ahead.
So, I mean, security deposits are that anti-Sybil mechanism, and the idea is that no adversary should be able to control so many validator slots. Essentially, there are like in a simplified model, you can imagine that there is only one size of deposit that you're allowed to take, and it's the minimum size of the deposit. And if you have like a deposit that's 20 of that, then you need to run 20 nodes, and like they're all your nodes. And you might be assigned to different shards and stuff, but the security deposit is the anti-Sybil mechanism, but it's definitely right that we sample the stake rather than the owners of the stake. Right? There is definitely an indirection there, but we do require for every node that is sampled that they actually do participate and fill the expectations of the protocol in terms of making bets, making blocks, etc.
Is the deposit fixed or proportional?
I think it's an adjusting target based on the amount of deposits that are being placed. At least in my protocol, I don't know.
I mean, the two are kind of equivalent, I think, right? It's like one approach is you have a fixed deposit size, and if you have 10 times as much, then, well, you have to go and get 10 validator slots. The other approach is that if you have 10 times as much, then you get one validator slot, but the validator slot gets basically assigned to everything 10 times as often. And you can show that those are pretty much mathematically equivalent. Like, I think the main difference is that with the discrete approach, if you have like 1.5 times the minimum, then you can't really do anything with the remaining 0.5. Whereas if you have like a variable slots with a minimum, then you can.
I was just going to say, from my own point of view, I would much prefer people have fixed, the security deposits are fixed in size, and you create a very large number of validators. So for example, if you have 100 validators, what you want to do is create 1 million validation identities. And then if you're randomly selecting some group to do something, the variance in the proportion of faulty nodes is reduced. And this drastically alters the mathematical properties that you're dealing with in your protocol. So I'd have a slightly different point of view on that, I suppose.
To be fair, if you sort of stretch that out to the limit at infinity, then that basically means in any kind of sharding setup, then every validator will have some stake in every shard and will have to download every shard.
Well, depending how you're organizing it, yeah.
And on the other hand, though, I think there are some benefits for that approach. Like, one of them is that you don't have to think like quite as much about it does reduce complexity when you have one size. And another more subtle one, I think, is that if you have a model where each individual validation identity is only making like a very small number of blocks between when it goes up, becomes a validator, and when it withdraws, then it makes it harder to do things like retaliating against specific validators you don't like. Whereas if they have like really long-term reputations, then there are like weird game theoretic attacks that you can do in between different validators.
Isn't there an inherent tension between being reliable and able to function during a network partition? Well, let's look at a situation. Say you're New Zealand, and you get partitioned off the network, and you want to have people still in New Zealand able to do transactions that are all local. But what happens if the number of validators and consensus nodes, if there aren't that many in New Zealand? How do you allow those nodes to keep on going forward, putting new blocks on the chain, and validate them, and then when the partition heals, have them not be all invalidated?
Okay, so New Zealand has, I believe, around like 0.05% of the world population, probably 0.1% of to 0.2% of GDP or so. So if you have 10,000 validators, then you can probably expect something like 10 or 20 of them to be in New Zealand. Now, that said, obviously, for that to work on a kind of per shard basis, then realistically what's going to happen is that New Zealand might end up having like one validator on some shards and 0 on other shards. So if you want to be able to tolerate partitions that are that tiny, then you do need to increase the number of validators. If we kind of change the question to something a bit larger scale, like something like, I don't know, like Australia, then in that case, what's going to happen is like basically the block time is going to go way up, and you might have like 10-minute blocks for a bit, and eventually the validator induction process is going to keep running, and after 1 or 2 epochs or so, then basically there's going to be a lot more validators that get inducted, and you're going to go right back to hopefully normal speed. As long as there's enough people.
So I just wanted to say there's a different approach which we take. So we separate top-level agreement on what the final state is, or at least what a digest of the final global state is. That's layer 1. Layer 2 down is a validation layer, and it's a global validation layer because we think you can't actually have validation happening on the shards. So when we talk about shards, what we really mean is something that keeps a replica of the state data. We don't really mean something that validates the transitions to that state data. And the reason is that if you allow a shard to validate its own data, right, the adversary can attack that shard, and it'll be much easier attacking that shard than the network as a whole because it's obviously a small partition of it. And then once the adversary controls the shard, he can start, awarding himself things and exporting his bad data to the other shards who are only validating their own data and consequently have no way of realizing that it's all gone foobar. So, that's something. So this same thinking also applies when you're thinking about how different geographical regions can operate independently. Okay, so it would be possible to create, a number of networks that are semi-independent, right, which had their own validation system within them. But the question would be, if you want to let this network validate its own data and operate independently, will the other networks trust it and allow that network to export its data to them, right? And it might well be there's a threshold, that if you have a large enough network, large enough networks may be able to trust each other, right? But there is going to be a threshold. And for the same reason that you can't really just have a shard validating its own data because the adversary can break a shard much more easily than you can break the whole network. So you need a global validation system, which is where a lot of the challenges come in when you want to do scalability. Right?
Yeah, so I want to provide a solution for New Zealand. So you have a blockchain in New Zealand with New Zealand validators that do whatever you want them to do, whether it be running an EVM shard or not. The security is completely determined by the New Zealand validators, so no external entity can really attack it unless we're talking about buying the stake or something. Otherwise, they're independent. And they connect to the global hub, which keeps track of all the side chains and how many tokens these side chains have. So we've developed a blockchain-to-blockchain communication protocol, we call it IBC, where each blockchain is a light client of each other. So the New Zealand blockchain can be a light client of the global hub blockchain and vice versa. And the global hub blockchain acts as a kind of a custodian, a virtual custodian. And it is the final say of where the tokens are. And so if I want to move money to my New Zealand account, I tell the hub, move tokens to New Zealand blockchain, and then I can use it there. When the network is partitioned, the hub will go down temporarily until it's healed. But meanwhile, you can use the New Zealand blockchain. That works for tokens very easily. If we were trying to scale out the general Ethereum virtual machine like this globally, it would be very difficult. I don't think we can actually solve that. It doesn't seem like something we can solve.
Okay, guys, if it's possible, we'll get one last question. Does that work? Okay.
All right. My question is, a lot of the stuff you've been talking about has been defenses that are economic defenses, where you got to put up money or you have to buy a ton of compute equipment to defend against stuff. What about a scorched earth attack? What if you have a large state-level adversary that doesn't want to steal money, they have plenty of money, they have their own economy, and they just want to shut the system down? Just want to burn it all to the ground. What are you doing to protect against that scenario?
Well, they can do it. They just have to burn basically.
Grab the mic there.
Yeah. The idea is that they can be our guest and then we'll just start the network again afterwards.
Yeah, and then we'll just keep on taking their money.
Yeah, because they literally have to buy tokens from stakeholders. There are the theoretical attacks where they credibly commit to doing it, and then that pushes the price of the tokens down, and then so they can do it on the cheap.
The problem is that those attacks rely on this notion that if a chain breaks, the price goes to zero. Whereas if a chain breaks, you can just hard fork it and restart.
Okay, so
empirically proven.
Right. So it really that analysis only works in a one-time game.
Well, it only works in a game where you assume that the chain, being 51% attacked, is death.
Okay.
When it's not.
Yeah.
So I think this goes back to the difference between traditional proof of work networks and proof of stake. That if a state level actor purchased enough hashing equipment and had the electricity supply, they could switch Bitcoin off anytime they wanted, right? But if you have a system that's dependent upon holding some tokens, right, that are recorded on the ledger, then in extremis, the community can get together, fork the network, the previously owned, the tokens that the state actor owned can be deleted from the ledger. And at this point, the state level actor has to purchase tokens in the new chain, right? And then, they can disrupt it again, but then the thing will fork again. And so they have unbounded costs. So actually, I think this is one of the most important reasons to move to these kind of architectures.
If anyone
It's
here
more-
is from a government and they want the 51% attack Ethereum when it goes to proof of stake, contact me. I have a lot of Ether to sell them.
I think proof of stake can be more anti-fragile than proof of work in some sense. Of course, proof of work chain can hard fork their mining function, right? But likewise, proof of stake can hard fork. But the difference is, like we said, in proof of work, the mining equipment and the infrastructure of like getting cheap electricity and the cooling system and all that is still there, and you can still use it. So there's actually less collateral in a proof of work system. Thereby, I think we would say that proof of stake systems are more anti-fragile than proof of work systems.
So just to add one, there is a way of doing it with proof of work. It's called puzzle towers. But this is going back quite a while. There's a cryptographic primitive called puzzle towers, and you can actually create a kind of temporal virtual kill switch over Bitcoin hardware. So you can introduce this actually to Bitcoin, and you can give Bitcoin the same property. But so when I'm saying proof of work doesn't have this property, I mean in the form currently deployed. Anyway.
I think something that makes people a little bit uneasy about this talk of like, oh, we'll just let the thing fail and restart it, is because like people are kind of uneasy about hard forks still, and I think that there's like a good reason for that. But I also think that if you do some careful thinking, you'll see that the same recovery mode is what the Bitcoin protocol would do if there was significant failure. So imagine if like a week of blocks was reverted because of a long double spend attack. Like I'm pretty sure the Bitcoin network would hard fork in order to prevent that week of blocks from being reverted.
And hard fork's a terrible, terrible name. There's so much terminology in this industry that needs to be abandoned, literally just put in the bin and just sealed. And hard fork is this, it sounds terrible. It's called a network upgrade, for God's sakes, right? Literally, right? What's the big deal, right?
Yeah, great. That's a great quote to end on. So I think if it's, we are somewhat over here, and I have questions myself. I'm sure, so just to let you all know, for those of you who have questions, I also have unanswered questions. So, but nevertheless, to give us a little bit of time before we get booted out of the building to chat and socialize, I think we'll end now. So let's thank these speakers and our panel. So let's